Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and today we are checking out the Templin Institute's Necron Dynasties. But before we get started, be sure to check out the merch store. New shirts are in. Got to see them back there. We're feeling worth picking up. Link is down below. All right, let's get into it.
On many worlds across the galaxy, curious structures have been found carved of black-hued stone, the forgotten remnants of some long-dead race. This is hardly unusual, and they are noted without much excitement among countless other ruins left by countless other races. Occasionally, expeditions will be sent to learn their secrets, and hidden entrances uncovered to vast complexes located far beneath a planet's surface. Sometimes, these parties return with exotic trinkets or half-believed tales. Sometimes, they do not return at all. Few across the galaxy recognize these sites for what they truly are, and the threat they represent. Fewer still might know how it came to be that one of the first races to set forth blindly into a galaxy of darkness would be damned for eternity, transformed into a tortured race of soulless constructs, known as the Necrons.
All right, probably not the same thing, but it's funny how sometimes being the first is not really the great advantage that you hope it is. And this is sometimes called, I think, first mover disadvantage. And what it means in business, if you are the first person to innovate something, you are the one who has to go through the whole learning curve of how to best operate it, right? So the example is railroads, right? Railroads were originally developed in the US, and all these different railroad companies had all these different gauges, and it took decades for the US to realize that there needed to be a single standard railroad gauge so that all cars became interoperable. But because Europe was just a couple of years behind, they saw the US having this debacle with railroad gauges, and before there was any large-scale railroads, they said, one gauge. This is going to be the gauge, and it's going to be standard throughout Europe, right? Saved a ton of time and a ton of money, right? And at the end of the day, after 50 years, both countries had full, robust rail systems. Europe just got to a more mature rail system faster because it didn't have to be the first mover. Obviously, that's not the case with the Necrons, right? Nobody else was watching the Necrons, conquer the galaxy and learn from their mistakes. But, well, I guess you could argue maybe the old ones, right? They saw the Necrons, realized they were a threat, designed different, less threatening races to counter them. Yeah, maybe.
Neither the gods nor galaxy were kind to the Necrontyr. Millions of years before humanity evolved to sentience, in an ancient formation of stars on the outer edge of the galaxy, they raised their civilization under the torturous light of a blighted sun. Endlessly scoured by piercing solar winds and terrible radiation, the lives of the Necrontyr were short and uncertain. Their bodies were consumed by agonizing cancers and constant illness. Their existence was defined by overwhelming loss and grief. Cities were built in honor of the dead, and the living who wandered their streets relegated to brief caretakers of vast sepulchres and ornate tombs.
Yeah, that seems like kind of a weird way for a civilization to operate. Life tends to evolve to be optimized to its environment. I've talked about this in other Necron videos. So it's interesting that the Necrons would have such a pained existence. But again, you could make the same argument about human beings, right? We live short lives. We are blighted very commonly with diseases. Almost every person in the developed world, I would argue, has been to the doctor to be treated for something at some point. And so maybe that's just a broad characterization of the Necron. Certainly, I guess, you could argue, right, that, every country in its capital has vast memorials to its war dead, to its fallen great leaders. Even buildings are named after our deceased heroes. So, in a sense, again, probably not quite the same. They're making it sound like the Necrontyr worship the dead at a way different scale than human beings. But human beings really do a lot to honor their dead. I mean, look, we even carry things like family names through generations. We name children after deceased relatives and grandparents and great-grandparents. So, yeah, actually, as I think about it, the Necrontyr may describe their fleshy bodies as being pretty cursed, but maybe not that different than human beings.
Driven by the desperate hope that they might free themselves from the cruel maladies of their son, the Necrontyr set out to carve an interstellar empire. Bereft of psychic powers, the Necrontyr were unable to pierce the Imperium, and instead relied upon slow-moving torch ships, carrying enormous stasis crypts. Though arduously slow to realize their dream, the Necrontyr were able to colonize much of the galaxy. Tragically, however, they could not rid themselves of their physical frailty, for even on rich, unspoiled worlds, the curse of their homeworld left them withered and short-lived. It was a terrible irony, then, that of the few other civilizations present in the galaxy, they should encounter the beings known as the Old Ones. Ancient even to the Necrontyr, the Old Ones had long since conquered the burden of mortality and now were gifted with eternal life. Yet it was a gift they refused to share, and the entire Necrontyr race was left to fester in jealousy and resentment.
I gotta say, I understand the plot point here, and the War in Heaven is actually a pretty badass fictional event. But if you're so advanced that you can have these like galaxy-spanning empires, and even if they don't have faster than light travel, in order to coordinate in any meaningful civilizational way, they must have had faster than light communications. And given all that, it really surprises me that they aren't able to bioengineer themselves out of mortality, creating like functional immortality, or that they're not able to engineer like a Mechanicus style, eternal life through continual part replacement, right? I mean, the Necron technology vastly supersedes that of the Imperium, and yet they were never at any point able to engineer their way out of soft, fleshy bodies. Seems kind of weird. Or maybe they were, but like even if you achieve functional immortality, right, eventually bad luck will catch up to you, and your spaceship will explode when you're 10,000 years old, or you trip on a nail and hit your head on the counter when you're 500, and like functional immortality is not the same as true immortality.
The unity that had propelled them into space was shattered, and competing Necrontyr dynasties warred with one another in a conflict that threatened to destroy their entire race. Had these wars of succession been allowed to continue, the Necrontyr might have been yet another footnote in galactic history, a civilization that rose, burned brightly and briefly, only to be extinguished. But the Triarch, the ruling council of three that governed the Necrontyr race, realized that only an external enemy had the power to reunite the dynasties and revive the spirit of their civilization. The choice was obvious. Only the Old Ones presented a credible threat, and the jealousy and resentment of the Necrontyr had been kindled into a burning rage. Successionist dynasties were offered amnesty. The Necrontyr reunited under the rule of the Triarch, and armies and fleets were sent to fight a war they could not win.
Oh yeah, this whole like settling up internal discord through an external enemy. I mean, this is classic of human beings on old planet Earth, and sometimes it's just true, right? You think about like World War II, when there really was a strong external enemy that necessitated the U.S. coming together to fight them. But sometimes things are a little more complicated. I think about things like the Cold War, right, where the U.S. and Russia were seen by the other as being a sort of mad superpower with designs on world domination. And in fact, both powers sort of had to use the other one as this boogeyman to keep their population in line. But to an extent, you demonize the other side hard enough, and eventually you have to behave as though they really are that malevolent a force. Now, it's true that, you know, the nuclear arms race, for example, really did, you know, that threat was real, right? If it was all for show, that we wouldn't have built real nuclear weapons. But certainly the propagandists on both sides worked hard to make sure that the existence of an external enemy was never allowed to fallow, right? Being weak against the enemy was a terrible charge leveled against competing politicians by their rivals. Supporting the military without question. To question the military was seen as being, again, supportive of the other side. Even things like regular political dissent was suppressed because it was seen as being associated with the other side. Sometimes comically so, where you would actually have people that advocated for the same thing being, smeared as being a capitalist or a communist, depending on which side you were, right? A lot of people who campaigned for the rights of ethnic minorities in both countries found themselves accused of being a capitalist sympathizer in the USSR and a communist sympathizer in the USA.
In contrast to the Necrontyr, the Old Ones were the masters of the Imperium. Through the use of warp gates and the extra-dimensional webway, they constantly outmaneuvered the plodding forces of the Necrontyr. Despite their superior technology, they were little more than an irritation to the Old Ones, and faced with an invincible enemy, the dynasties fell back into civil war among themselves. Having only accelerated the complete collapse of their rule, the Triarch again searched for salvation. Competing accounts differ on how the Necrontyr first encountered the C'tan. Some claim they were discovered in the heart of a dying star, while others say that the burning hatred the Necrontyr held for the Old Ones acted as a type of beacon. Regardless, the power of the C'tan was incalculable. Beings of incredible raw energy, the C'tan dwarfed entire worlds, their consciousness too vast to even comprehend. That the Necrontyr could even communicate with them was a miracle, and the oldest dynasties actively courted their favor. Through an eldritch type of living metal, the incorporeal forms of the C'tan were gifted bodies to inhabit in the physical realm.
I mean, sometimes I hear a lot of science fiction fantasy that make these statements of a being of incalculable power and size. And one of the things that's interesting always to me is the argument that if you had... when people first discovered mathematics, human beings, we realized we could use it to model simple things that happened in the natural world. We could model, say, a bowling ball dropped out of a tower, right, in the 1700s. And as our computing power advanced and our ability to literally perform computations advanced, so did our ability to predict and understand outcomes, right? So we went from being able to predict how fast a bowling ball will fall in, the 1780s, to by the 1880s, we were able to model how a disease spreads through a population. We were able to model basic statistics, like a normal distribution, right? We would be able to model, say, the size of clams in a given clam field, right? Some are small, some are big. But now, in the present, in the 1980s, right, we're able to model things like the behavior of, huge groups of people as an economy. We're able to model the way the prices people will pay for goods. We're able to even model things like the trajectory of a rocket ship as it burns fuel and passes through space. This all to say that if you had, and now we use supercomputers, right, performing an unimaginable number of calculations to determine things like to shape proteins and determine how they would operate in the body. We can model, for example, cars, right? We can determine how cars will behave in wind and in accidents using these computers, right? Simulating very complex realities. And so the theory goes, if you had a computer large enough, again, a thinking machine, or in this case, a thinking being, right, the size of like a planet, could you predict the future with a high level of certainty? Or could you model the future with a really high level of certainty? It's sort of interesting to think about, right? And so if you had a being of this size, right, and this complexity and this level of energy, one, it's not clear that if they had that level of energy and that level of size, that they would be bound by chronological time like we are. And two, right, what would it be like if your synapses were light years away? If, like, time itself, you had to deal with relativity as your brain synapses were firing, right? It's a mind melting to think about it. But if you were that big, if you were a thinking machine, a brain the size of a world, like, how far into the future and with what level of certainty could you predict? Could you model every particle, every atom operating? Could you see the model of the psychological profile of every Necron and model their behavior in response to a stimulus? Like, you probably could, right? And the entire Necron race probably doesn't have the mass of your computer. And again, in the modern world, we have computers, the computer the size of my desktop can more or less effectively model, look at all the video game crap it models. It models complex behaviors. It models people and buildings and everything else. So, yeah, I would be shocked if a group of mortal people-sized brains even attempted to communicate with a being of, like, truly unimaginable power, right? It would be almost impossible. And to negotiate with them would be like an ape trying to negotiate with you as a person, right? Like, you could deceive them so easily if they could even comprehend the idea of a transaction as you saw it, right? They could maybe get a crude facsimile of trade, but they could never understand the complex human nature of, like, trade and agreement and loyalty and friendship and exchange and the game theory of repeated behaviors, right? So again, the idea that these, like, mega ultra beings and standard soft fleshy regular brains could reach some sort of consensus seems preposterous to me.
Thus clad, their consciousness and power was focused, and they soon came to delight in the pleasures available within the material universe. One such Catan, acting as a forerunner to the coming of his brothers, appeared before the Triarch. It claimed it and its kind, like the Necrontyr, had fought a war against the Old Ones, a war they had lost, and now were hidden across the galaxy, eagerly awaiting allies who might help bring that ancient race to account. It promised the Necrontyr everything they had wanted: unity, power, and most importantly, the secret of immortality. With the pact between the Necrontyr and the Catan sealed, the star gods revealed the form that immortality would take. Enormous bio-furnaces were constructed and roared through the days and nights. What arcane procedures took place within are best forgotten. But while it was the people of the Necrontyr race who entered them, it was something else entirely that emerged. In place of diseased and frail bodies came shells of living metal, and the awful truth of the Pact made clear. Through their transformation, the Necrontyr race had perished, stripped not only of their flesh, but of their souls. Yet while the price had...
Just want to point out the weird inconsistency of a creature having no soul, but also no presence in the warp. I thought those things were like one and the same.
Been steep, every promise made by the Catan was fulfilled. Clad in armor that only their most terrible injuries could destroy, the newly born Necron race and their Catan allies wrought a terrible vengeance upon the Old Ones. Even as their last strongholds were broken, and even as the webway was penetrated and invaded, the Triarch had realized the deception played upon their own people. Where they had once feasted on the energy of the stars, now the Catan feasted upon living souls. The star gods had gorged themselves on the Necrontyr, and brought to the galaxy a war of such horror that even the victors would find no triumph. In an act of perfectly calculated betrayal, the Necrons waited until the Old Ones had been wiped out, and then turned on the Catan in their moment of victory. Weakened and arrogant as the result of their long struggle, the Catan were shattered by the unimaginable energies of the living universe, focused into weapons too mighty for even the star gods to endure. While the Catan were a part...
That's a jerk move, man. That's a jerk move. I mean, they had it coming. They completely had it coming. I still am not clear on the removal of souls of a race that had no connection to the warp, or did they and they just weren't psychers? It's just not clear to me at all.
Part of a fundamental fabric of reality, and therefore impossible to destroy completely. Their shattered forms were bound within thousands of smaller fragments, scattered across the galaxy, so they might never reform. The Catan had been shattered, but the time of the Necrons was over. The cost to their civilization had been immense, and powerful psychic entities, unleashed during the wars against the Old Ones, threatened to scour the galaxy. Younger races, created by the Old Ones to aid in their war, were also rising, with the wrath of the Eldari, in particular, impossible for Necrons to stand against. The Silent King, first among the Triarch, and the only member of that council who survived betraying the Catan, gave one final order. His people were commanded to sleep, to wait for a time in which even the great power of the Eldari had withered, and the Necrons might return to rule the galaxy. With this order fulfilled, the Silent King vanished, fleeing into the intergalactic void, seeking solace and penance for the...
Yeah, if there's one thing that happens in the real world, it's that leaders, people who are truly at the pinnacle of their country or people, man, they can't leave. They just don't have the psychological mechanism, right? The classic example, Assad, right, in Syria. There's a guy whose country was being ripped apart around him. And he was offered several times by the international community to just abdicate power, turn it over to an existing legislative body peacefully, and then live in exile as a tremendously, eye-wateringly wealthy, regular private citizen. But the idea of being only a man of immense, phenomenal wealth, but without being the dynastic head of a country, was just unacceptable. It was unthinkable, right? And there's so many dictators that meet their end that way, just unable to see the bigger picture for what it is. And yeah, so the idea that the Necron Silent King would just sort of dip out and do his penance in the intergalactic space is preposterous, right? It never would happen in human beings. Human beings just love themselves too much to ever do something like that.
The terrible suffering he had inflicted upon his people. On countless worlds, the skeletal constructs of the Necrons lay dormant. They slumbered through the aeons as the galaxy healed from the wounds wrought during the war against the Old Ones, and new civilizations rose to fill the void left by their demise. But time wounded the Necrons in ways even their ancient enemies could not. Shifting tectonic plates crushed Necron strongholds on untold planets. Stars went supernova, consuming tomb worlds in their death throes. And everywhere, primitive races fought over the scraps of Necron territories. Even tomb worlds left untouched have felt the decay of time.
Again, Necrons, super geniuses, live forever. Time is unimportant to them. And yet, they can't figure out which stars are going to go supernova. They can't model the tectonic movement of a planet over, again, 10 million years? Something like that, right? In geological time, that's not a ton of time.
Cascading failures in stasis crypts destroyed billions of dormant Necrons, while others have been affected by a slow madness that threatens to override their original programming. Even the last order of the Silent King has not been precisely followed. The great awakening of the Necron race has not occurred in unison, but in fitful starts across the millennia. Errors in circuits and protocols have enacted the revivification of tomb worlds far earlier than intended.
It's definitely not because the competing dynasties realized that there is a tremendous advantage to waking up a little earlier than your enemies, so you can crush them while they sleep. And of course, if every dynasty and sub-dynasty and sect realizes this, then they're all going to have randomly programmed wake-up times.
With some said to have stirred in time to see the great crusade of the Emperor of Mankind, the cataclysm of the Horus Heresy, or the endless wars of the age of the Imperium. While many have risen, most lay dormant still. The first skeletal machines encountered by the younger races were misidentified either as mindless constructs, another trivial Xenos race on par with Hrud or Kroot, or most curiously, as chaos androids constructed by an extinct subspecies of abhumans. Of all the great powers in the galaxy, only the remnants of the Eldari understand the full nature of the Necron civilization. All Necrons, regardless of their rank or station, have had their flesh replaced with necrodermis. This living metal possesses the extraordinary ability to regenerate damage nearly instantaneously, flowing back together as if a liquid to repair even the largest gashes or tears. Given enough time, even the most terribly damaged Necron constructs can be repaired, or its consciousness transferred to a new body. Only a select few Necron constructs, however, possess a consciousness in the way the Imperium or the other races of the galaxy might understand it. The transformation of the Necrontyr race stripped the intellect, self-awareness, and personality from all but the most strong-willed. These individuals, often the leaders or elite of Necrontyr society, were given the very finest necrodermis bodies.
Yeah, I know with human brains, it's sort of strange to think about, but like, we have this philosophical idea of like a persistent self, right? That you are the same person that, you are the same person you were when you're 14, when you're 24, when you're 34, when you're 44. But we see from research that the human brain's kind of weird, right? There's areas that sort of can get damaged over time, right? That can cause changes in personality. There's diseases that cause significant dramatic changes in again, fundamental behaviors, who you are, how you treat people. You can look up the classic one is this guy Phineas Gage, and he was a railroad worker in the 1800s who suffered a brain injury, a pretty catastrophic brain injury, to a very specific part of his brain. And as a result, this was a guy who didn't drink, didn't gamble, like was a really taciturn, humorless, hard-working, disciplined guy. But after the injury, right, cognitively he was fine, but he would drink, he would get in fights, he would, engage engage with prostitutes, right? It was just generally, it was almost like a different person altogether. And it started some of the science of neurology in a lot of ways, because people realized that parts of the brain control personality and how you view things. All right, so we can actually know that based on behavior changes, or based on like the location of, say, a stroke, we can guess at what sort of changes a person may experience to their personality. It's pretty interesting stuff.
But even they are...
But the idea that you can strip away whole chunks of consciousness and still leave the ability to make certain types of decisions. Again, Necron brains, different stuff, and certainly different when you're talking about circuitry. But it's interesting to me that they incorporated this concept, right? That they argued that, like, okay, we're going to keep this like some unspecified small part of the person, and then the rest is going to be like an automaton.
Pale shadows of their former selves. The professional soldiery were given comparatively crude bodies, while the common citizen received whatever remained. These tortured creatures are numb to all joy and experience, bound solely to the will of their masters, and requiring constant direction to fulfill their purpose. Even so, a tiny spark of their mortal selves remain, just enough to torment
So, servitors. They became servitors.
them with memories and echoes. During the time of the Necrontyr, their civilization embraced a rigid hierarchy. While split between various dynasties, all were ultimately subject to the will of the Triarchy, a council of 3 pharaons, the greatest and most powerful leaders of their race. The head of this council was known as the Silent King, for he never addressed his subjects directly, but rather through the pharaons who ruled alongside him. The short lifespan of the Necrontyr ensured that members from many dynasties were represented within the Triarch, or held the position of Silent King itself. Following that...
This is also really common. In the U.S., we call it a power sharing agreement, and it's, or in the U.S., in modern times, we call this a power sharing agreement, and it's really common in countries that have experienced like pretty vicious civil wars. And as a compromise, there is sometimes an agreement for a rotation among leadership positions. One example would be Lebanon, which has strong Muslim, Christian, and Jewish? No, maybe Shia Muslim, Sunni Muslim, and Christian. Something like that. And they have to have an agreement where they rotate the religion of the president and the prime minister and like their version of a speaker of the house, right? And this power sharing agreement, this rotation, allows for a level of free elections, sure, but allows every community to see itself in the leadership of their country, and also gives them prevents their religious group from being marginalized.
Their bio-transference, the hierarchy of the Necrontyr became absolute with the Necrons. Completely subservient to the will of the Silent King, even the pharaons were forced to follow his directives through command protocols embedded in every Necron mind. So ashamed by his failures, however, the last Silent King severed these protocols upon his withdrawal from the galaxy, and ultimate authority had been split across the various dynasties that remained. Pharaons and other ranks of Necron overlords have awoken to find themselves free of the Silent King and able to pursue their own agendas. Combined with aberrations in their programming that leave some overlords struck by madness, The actions of the Necron race are eclectic almost to the point of randomness. The Necron lords of some dynasties display a splendid adherence to honorable conduct, sending forth emissaries and diplomats. On the battlefield, they adhere to the spectacle of honorable war, rigorously applying their ancient codes of battle. Other dynasties have embraced treachery and terror, utilizing psychological warfare, deception, and assassination. More still focus their attention inwards, pursuing the systematic extermination of any life forms who interfere with their affairs.
Yeah, it's also interesting just to see, like, if you were the Imperium or the Eldar or any other race, you would probably look at the Necrons, which are probably indistinguishable to you if you don't really know Necron business, and their behaviors would look totally bizarre, right? Almost incomprehensible. And you can imagine a bunch of Inquisition Orden Xenos trying to figure out what the Necrons were doing by trying to gauge their different behaviors, treating them as though they were like humanity and under a single unified command structure operating in the same way. Again, to draw a Cold War example, there was a persistent belief among U.S. scholars and policymakers that all communist movements were at the beck and call of Moscow. And they had this very monolithic view, and so it made interpreting the actions of different communist movements difficult because there was an underlying assumption that they were all behaving in concert, when in reality, it was a huge variety of interest groups, a huge variety of countries that would basically just put on the communism brand in order to manipulate the Soviet Union into giving them support or weapons or diplomatic relations or whatever they sought. So the result was that it was more like a difficult to manage menagerie. It was more like Space Marine chapters, right? Where trying to form a singular intent of Space Marines is, even that's pretty relatively easy. But if you were a pick a race here. If you were a Necron trying to understand why all the Space Marine chapters do different shit and trying to pick out a strategy, like, the Blood Ravens stole a relic, but then the Ultramarines like came in and tried to repel this world, and then the Black Templars were just started killing everybody, but we just talked to the Ultramarines and we reached an agreement, and so you would be totally lost, right? You would be unable to comprehend a strategy. Like, is somebody lying to us? Is what's the real objective, right? When in fact it's just because they never talk. They all do their own thing, and it doesn't make any sense because they're all just completely they're all trying to achieve different things in different situations. So it's easy to get that tunnel vision, right? Because it's simple. As human beings, we think in terms of hierarchies, and we believe that there's a hierarchy, and it's way more difficult to understand that something that even has the same brand, again, like a Space Marine, they all have power armor, they all have bolters, and you're like, and they all sort of fight Xenos, and you're like, Space Marines are all answering to the same authority, but not really.
While these acts are extraordinarily diverse in their extent and method, all are directed towards a single common goal: the restoration of the Necron dynasties to rule over the galaxy. Yet with the Triarch long destroyed, most tomb worlds still dormant, and others inflicted with madness, there can be no grand strategy. Each tomb lord pursues whatever course he deems most suited to circumstance. Some have sought to dominate nearby threats and sow terror on alien worlds. Others have stockpiled raw materials, or prioritized the recovery of cultural treasures or artifacts. A few have even begun the search for organic species whose bodies might be suitable vessels to reverse the curse of bio-transference and bring about the return of the mortal Necrontyr.
Oh, weird. Also, man, don't let them find out about cloning.
When committed to battle, the Necrons typically strike with little warning. A Necron Lord will have a great variety of forces at his command, but will typically rely on soldiers known simply as warriors or immortals, which made up the ancient armies of the Necrontyr. Lichguard, Deathmarks, and Praetorians are used more sparingly, while the largest Necron constructs are reserved for wars of annihilation and vast interstellar campaigns. Their highly advanced technology means that their armies typically need only march forward, and an overwhelming, inexorable advance has become synonymous with the Necrons. Despite this, they are capable of more nuanced tactics when necessary, and there exist a variety of Necron constructs capable of infiltration or rapid maneuver. But the Necrons' greatest advantage in combat remains their near-indestructible necrodermis bodies.
Yeah, I mean, the war of attrition has been effective throughout basically every era of history. There is a way to fight a war of attrition, and though it doesn't always depend on slow plotting gains. Well, no, maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong. Can you think of an era in history where there wasn't a way to fight a war that involved slow plotting, incremental gains made in a series of low-risk battles, right? I can't think of one where it was truly like not feasible. Even modern warfare, right? There's a way to fight counterinsurgency, right? That is just slow and plotting. It's called the oil spot method, where you establish tiny little perimeters of areas that you are absolutely certain are free of enemy activity, and then you slowly expand out, and you have 15 or 20 of these little expanding circles across a map, and eventually they link together. Was it super effective? No, not really, but it was a theory.
The rare instances in which their armies have been destroyed, or the tide of battle has turned against them, every Necron construct has simply disappeared from the battlefield, phase shifting to some other place or reality, so that they might repair their wounds, only to re-emerge once more. The method by which the Necrons achieve this remains unknown. They likely retain some access to the webway, forcing their way into the ancient labyrinth through the use of eldritch portals known as Dolmen Gates. Necron starships have also been occasionally sighted, but never in great numbers. Whether the Necron fleet did not survive their long slumber intact, or they have the means to conceal their movements, likewise remains unknown. To the Imperium of Man and the other great powers of the galaxy, the Necrons remain a shrouded presence. Terrible when roused to battle and cryptic in their actions, but hardly a major presence.
Yeah, I will say tactically it is a great decision to withdraw as soon as you realize you are taking losses. This is we talked about war of attrition. The other one, hit and run tactics, right? You don't always need to achieve a total victory at every set battle, right? Not every battle needs to be a set piece battle. If you can expend fewer resources and force the enemy to drain a tremendous volume of theirs, that can be a perfectly effective strategy. No shortage of examples. Again, the classic is, of course, the U.S. and Vietnam, where, the North Vietnamese had a beautifully elegant system of logistics and resupply, right, where they would really expend very few resources in order to field a combat soldier. In contrast, the U.S. would have to train a combat soldier, fly them across the world, feed them, clothe them, provide them medical care, provide them uniform, gear, ammunition, food, water, and finally have them march through the jungle for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, and then finally, hopefully, maybe encounter an enemy who would shoot at them some, wound them maybe, and then withdraw into the bush. And, of course, after a year of that soldier would have to be flown back, demobilized, treated for their wounds if necessary, and would have to collect VA benefits, right? So when you realize that the tremendous expenditure, for every soldier in the field that the NVA put, it probably cost the United States probably 10, maybe 100, maybe 200 times as many resources and money to put one of their soldiers in the field. So, again, you think about the Necrons and it's like, hey, you fight the Space Marines, you kill a couple Space Marines, you crush a couple of Guardsmen, and when things start to look a little hairy for you, you just dip out. And you come back later when they're more vulnerable, right? Did the Space Marines win? Maybe. Maybe they won their battle, but you forced them to burn at a much greater rate than you did. And it makes sense because we know the Necrons are very patient and have a very long-term view of time. So the idea that they have to win a specific battle is sort of silly to them.
With the fall of Cadia and the spread of the Great Rift across the galaxy, there are precious few resources to devote to the search of the rumored Tomb Worlds, or the mysteries of some long-dead race. But as the time of ending begins across the galaxy, it is becoming harder and harder to ignore that Tomb Worlds are beginning to awaken at an ever-increasing rate. Certain patterns are starting to emerge, evidence that the power of the ancient Necron Empire is beyond even what the Eldari remember. As the great hive tendrils of the Tyranids sweep across the galaxy, it has been noted that even they avoid specific worlds. On Mars, an entire region has been quarantined, ostensibly due to some ancient contamination, but in truth, because a fearful entity dwells beneath it. A so-called Dragon of Mars. And despite the rampant spread of the ruinous powers, and other warp-spawned horrors, there are curious places in the galaxy where even the overwhelming howls of the warp have been silenced. Places where the silence is far worse than the screams.
Okay, guys, alright. Being a little dramatic here. You can't be too dramatic for 40k, I know.
Some have even claimed that the stars themselves whisper of the Silent King, that its exile is over, and it walks among the dynasties once more. If the Great Awakening is finally at hand, then the remnants of the Eldari, the vast host of the Imperium, the Orc hordes and Tyranid hive mind, even the gods of chaos themselves, might finally learn that for all their fearsome power, this galaxy was never truly theirs. That they are merely trespassers, whose time is finally over.
Whoa! What? Alright, let's skip ahead a little. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah.
Wonderful. I was concerned I might have missed you. Please allow me to express my fulsome appreciation of your investigation, as you call it. Thoroughly researched and well spoken. Delightful from beginning to end. A few errors here and there. A few omissions. I had hoped that I or my collection might warrant inclusion. But you make cuts for time. I entirely understand.
Oh man, this is oh my gosh, Trazyn? Right? Okay, I really got to read The Infinite and the Divine. I'm waiting for the actual book to come out. I hate reading on screens.
I am something of a seeker into mystery myself, and I feel a sense of professional courtesy to inform you that the presence of your institute has not gone unnoticed here. You are watched by some of whom you are already aware, and by others of which you are not. It is so rare to find those who might appreciate my work. It would be such a shame to see you become an agent of disorder. Until then, feel free to visit any time. There is always a place for you here.
Investigates the nations, factions.
All right. Okay, that was fun. You know, I really appreciate the Templin Institute throwing those little fun tidbits of lore in there. Really makes it a fun channel to watch all the way through. But But yeah, this was a great look. I was really hoping to get more into the Necron dynasties themselves. I know our friend Major Kill has a video. Let me know in the comments if you think I should check, if that is worth checking out. And of course, be sure to check out the merch, man. You can see it right there. See it hanging up back there. It's a great way to support the channel and score some fun swag. All right, until next time, I will see you guys later.